Welcome back. We now start our series of videos on ancient Athenian history that will span most of the entire course here on ancient Greek myth and tragedy. The first video here will run through a brief overview of the periods of history that we are discussing. I'm going to, in the next video, talk a little bit more precisely about the Persian Wars so that you understand the context for Aeschylus's first play Persians that you read for today. We will come back to the Persian Wars in somewhat more detail when we get to their appropriate time in our historical timeline that we are reproducing here. But let us begin by explaining a few brief points about ancient Athenian history. First of all, there are two periods for ancient Athens that are relevant for this course and also for the city of Athens. One is called Archaic, and that runs from approximately 800 BC down to 480 BC. And the second is called Classical, and that runs from 480 BC to 322 BC. There are, of course, earlier and later periods of ancient Greek history as well. Prior to 800 BC, there had been the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, who were the very early Greeks, and in whose time period the Trojan War in ancient Greek mythology is supposed to have occurred. Then there was a Dark Age period, and then we come to the Paulus period with the Archaic Age. So there were other periods, but for the standpoint of what we're looking at for Athens, these are the only two that we need to concern ourselves with in this particular course. Now, the Archaic period in ancient Athens was focused especially on developing Athens as what in ancient Greek was called a polis, P-O-L-I-S. Polis, you could probably see, is the root word for our words politics and political in English. And in fact, those two words can be somewhat echo what you have here. The work supposedly by Aristotle, although scholars sometimes question whether it really is his, called Athenian Politeia, that's Atheniaion, and then Politeia, Politeia. Athenian Politeia is the work translated as the government of the Athenians, and it is a historical overview of the civics in early Athenian civilization before their main period when they had democracy, as we will see in later lectures. So the polis is being developed. Now, Athens was, of course, by no means the only polis. There was also Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, Argos, and quite a few others, smaller ones. Those were some of the major ones. So what does a polis exactly entail? A polis is basically an ancient city-state. That means that it encompasses the physical city, usually encompassed by walls, although Sparta was a notable exception that never did have walls surrounding it. It refers to the city, the grounds inside it, and also the territory that is controlled by that city around it. And most of the major cities, and even some of the minor ones, did control or at least have political influence over the territories surrounding them. So a polis really encompasses that whole territory. But it goes further still than just the geographic definition. Polis also refers to all of the institutions that make up a city. So that would mean the government. It could include education, trade, economics, slavery, marriage, childbearing, inheritance, all the laws, and so on. All of that is considered to be part of the polis. So it means a lot more than just city. It refers to the entire body of the legal matters and the civilization that goes on inside the polis, the citizenry, everything all together. And of course, different polis in the ancient world were run by different kinds of governments. The Athenians are actually rather distinct as eventually having a democracy. This was not a particularly popular form of government among the ancient Greeks, and even the Athenians themselves sometimes had some difficulties with it. Socrates himself, I do not believe, was especially fond of ancient democracy, and neither was his famous disciple Plato, in his philosophies. Neither was Aristotle. Democracy was certainly one form of government, but there were also, of course, monarchies. There was oligarchy. And in some cases, you have what's called tyranny, T-Y-R-A-N-N-Y, which involves a particular person who essentially changes around the government and replaces the old government with his particular rule. A tyranny, despite the sound of the name, was not necessarily a negative thing. There were, in fact, a fair number of tyrannies, including in Athens, that were actually fairly positive in their influence on both the citizens and the state as a whole. However, tyranny came to be a very suspicious form of government for later Greeks, including in their philosophy, because it was recognized as being the rule of a single person whom you'd have to trust to consider it in both his and the city's best interest to rule the city as a single entity. And of course, in many cases, that was not something you could really rely upon. And tyrants also were always consistently concerned with being overthrown. So that could lend them in the direction of becoming actual dictators in the sense that we would think of, and potentially oppressing their citizens. So it was a somewhat suspicious form of government. So again, so Apollos, and there we are in the darkness. Now we wave the hand, and we get back into the light again. Polis, therefore, can include, as I said, many different kinds of government. Now, in the case of the ancient Athenians, we have, in its early days, kings. The most famous king is Theseus. You may know him from the story of the Minotaur in Crete, the monster, half man, half bull, inside of the labyrinth that King Minos kept prisoner there, and fed with the help of some Athenian men and women who were forced to become its food due to an arrangement that Minos had with Athens after Athenians killed his son Androgeus. So Theseus was in fact eventually a king of Athens after his father Aegeus. But in later days, after the king period, there were the archons, A-R-C-H-O-N. The archons were a group of 9 rulers who were elected annually in Athens, starting in the year 684 BC. We'll cover them in a later video in more detail. So that's what you have in the earlier days before democracy. Democracy itself was actually founded in 508 BC, but it continued on in Athens fairly consistently for a couple of centuries, with one major exception that we'll talk about in a much later video. And after the 322 period, it kept on going on and off. At that time, the Athenians came under the control of the northern Macedonians, and so did not have democracy as consistently in their city. But democracy was the mainstay for Athenian government in this period, 480 BC to 322 BC. The reason why we use the date 480 is that this is in the middle of the big Persian Wars. The battle that you read about in Aeschylus's Persians was the Battle of Salamis, which was the major sea victory for the Athenians in 480 BC that defeated the Persians in their second of 2 invasions into Greece, carried out by King Xerxes, whom you may remember in the movie 300. So the Persian Wars essentially ended up historically defining what scholars now refer to as the classical period, because 480 BC was such a momentous year for the Athenians that it was really the one that allowed the Athenians to suddenly become supremely powerful for a period in the ancient Greek world, riding on their democracy. And so that's why we distinguish this period as the classical period, when the Athenians rose to greatness for a relatively brief but nonetheless really impressive time in the ancient Greek world. Okay, so that's what we have, archaic and classical. In the next video, I'm going to give you a very quick synopsis of the Persian Wars, just enough for you to understand the context of ancient Persia, and then that will be our final video for today. We will also talk briefly in the same video about Persians itself, so that you can combine both the history and the production of the story as you see it laid out in the tragedy. We will see you very quickly in the next video.